We need to try living separately for 7 days. Okay, this words really hit me like a freight train. 5 years of marriage and suddenly she wanted a trial separation. Not because of any major fight or betrayal, but because she needed space to reassess our relationship. When she first suggested this ridiculous experiment, I kept my face completely neutral despite the rage building inside. She explained how her recently divorced friend had recommended this healthy exercise to gain perspective. According to her, we'd still be married, just living separate lives for exactly 1 week to appreciate each other more. I wasn't born yesterday. This wasn't about appreciation. This was a test when I refused to fail by begging or showing weakness. Instead, I looked her directly in the eyes and said, if that's what you want, I'll respect it. 7 days starting tomorrow. The shock on her face was immediate. She'd expected resistance, tears, perhaps even anger. My calm acceptance threw her completely off balance. She stammered, asking if I was upset. I simply replied, you've made your decision. I'm making mine on how to handle it. That night, I slept in the guest room without another word. The next morning, while she was still asleep, I began implementing my plan. First, I transferred half our joint account funds to my personal account. Nothing illegal, just protecting my assets during this separation. She wanted it so badly. By 9 a.m., I had blocked her on all social media platforms and changed my relationship status to it's complicated. My phone immediately exploded with notifications from mutual friends. I ignored them all. When she finally woke up and came downstairs, I was already rearranging the living room, moving her decorative pillows and photos into boxes. What are you doing? She demanded, still in her nightgown. Respecting your wishes, I replied without looking up. You wanted separate lives for a week. That means separate spaces, too. While she stood frozen, I continued methodically removing every trace of her from the main bedroom. Her clothes were carefully packed into suitcases and placed in the guest room. Her toiletries, makeup, everything relocated. I wasn't angry or spiteful about it. I was efficient, calm, and resolute. This is not what I meant, she protested, following me around as I worked. We're supposed to be reflecting on our relationship. Not. I am reflecting, I interrupted. And my reflection tells me that when someone wants space, you give it to them completely. No half measures. By midday, I had transformed our shared spaces. The house now reflected my aesthetic alone. Minimal, functional, distinctly masculine. Her plush throws, scented candles, and artsy photographs were neatly boxed up in the spare room where she'd be staying. You're taking this too far, she said, tears forming in her eyes. Am I? You suggested this separation. I'm simply honoring it properly. My voice remained level, controlled. 7 days of separate lives means exactly that. You live your life, I live mine. I then informed her that I'd be going out that evening with friends. She wasn't invited. When she protested, I reminded her of her own words, spirit lives, separate activities. Before leaving, I handed her a written schedule for kitchen and common area usage to avoid uncomfortable overlaps during our separation period. Her face showed the first real signs of regret, but I didn't acknowledge it. Day 1 of 7, I said as I grabbed my keys. Enjoy your space and your reflection time. I know I will. As I closed the door behind me, I caught a glimpse of her standing alone in what was now essentially my living room, surrounded by the consequences of her own request. The message was clear. Be careful what you wish for. You just might get it completely. I woke up early on the second day of our separate lives experiment, feeling unexpectedly refreshed. The master bedroom, now cleared of her belongings, had an almost liberating emptiness to it. I checked my phone to find 17 missed calls and over 30 text messages from her. Each one progressively more desperate than the last. Why did you block me on social media? This isn't what I meant by separate lives. You're being extreme. Please call me back. Are you trying to scare me? I read through them dispassionately before putting my phone away without responding. Actions have consequences. A lesson she clearly needed to learn. After my morning workout and shower, I made a call that I'd been considering since yesterday. Within an hour, a professional cleaning crew arrived at our home. Her eyes widened when she emerged from the guest room to find 5 people in uniforms moving through our living space. "What's happening?" she demanded, still in her pajamas, looking completely blindsided. "Home makeover," I replied calmly while signing the service agreement. "I've always wanted to redecorate, but you've always had final say on our home's appearance. Since we're living separate lives this week, I thought it was the perfect opportunity for some changes." The cleaning crew began systematically transforming our shared space. The floral curtains she had insisted on replaced with modern blinds. The pastel wall colors she had chosen now being painted over with deep masculine tones. The decorative furniture she had selected over my objections being moved to storage. "You can't just change everything without consulting me," she protested, voice rising with each word. I turned to her with perfect composure. "Actually, according to you, we're living separate lives right now. I don't need to consult you about my life decisions during this period. That was your rule." She stormed back to the guest room, slamming the door. I continued directing the crew with specific instructions on how I wanted my living space to reflect my preferences. Not hers, not ours, but mine alone. By midday, I received a text from her saying she was coming home early from work to discuss this situation properly. Her message radiated panic and regret. I didn't respond, but I made my own preparations. When she arrived home at 2 p.m., she found me in the newly redecorated living room with an attractive female colleague. We were reviewing documents spread across the coffee table, sitting comfortably close to each other. "Oh, you're back," I said casually. "This is Vanessa from my office." She needed help with a project, and since I have this new independent living situation this week, I invited her over. The look on my wife's face was indescribable. A mixture of shock, jealousy, and dawning horror at the implications of her separate lives proposal. Vanessa, who knew nothing about our situation, smiled politely and commented on how nice the new renovations looked. "I should go," my wife muttered, clearly thrown off balance by this unexpected scenario. "Whatever works for you," I replied with professional detachment. "Remember the schedule for common areas that I made? It's on the fridge." After she retreated to the guest room, Vanessa and I continued working for another hour. When she left, I made no effort to explain the situation to my wife, who remained sequestered in her temporary space. That evening, I ordered delivery for myself, only her favorite restaurant, deliberately. The scent of the food filled the apartment. When she emerged, eyeing the food longingly, I simply continued eating while watching a game on our newly repositioned television. "We need to talk about what's happening," she finally said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I looked up briefly. "Day 2 of 7. We can talk on day 8 when this experiment of yours is complete. Until then, I'm taking the separate lives concept seriously, exactly as you requested." As she stood there, I could see the realization washing over her. This trial she had initiated was revealing consequences she hadn't anticipated. The separate lives she had asked for were becoming increasingly real, and with each hour that passed, the distance between us grew more tangible. "This isn't what I wanted," she whispered. "Then you shouldn't have asked for it," I replied, turning my attention back to the game. The ball was in her court now, but I had changed the rules of engagement entirely. Day 3 of our separation experiment brought unexpected developments. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly, not with messages from my wife, but from our mutual friends. Apparently, she'd been reaching out to everyone in our social circle, spinning her version of events. "Dude, what's going on? Your wife says you're taking this break thing way too seriously." Read a text from my closest friend. Another message. "She's really upset. Says, you've completely misunderstood what she wanted with this separation week." I smiled to myself. Classic damage control. The narrative was being rewritten, not as her reckless suggestion to live separate lives, but as my extreme overreaction to an innocent exercise. Rather than respond individually, I formulated a more strategic approach. After my morning coffee, I took several photos of the redesigned living room, kitchen, and master bedroom. I carefully framed each shot to highlight the transformation, the removal of her decorative touches, the more masculine aesthetic now dominating our shared space. With these visual proofs in hand, I made my counter move. First, I posted on social media where I'd unblocked her specifically so she could see this as a status update. Sometimes life gives you unexpected opportunities for growth and renewal. Embracing change and rediscovering myself. This week #new beginnings #fresh start. I attached the photos of the apartment's transformation. Within minutes, the post garnered attention from our entire social network, including her friends who had undoubtedly heard her side of the story. As predicted, my phone rang almost immediately. It was her mother. Concern evident in her voice. "What's happening between you two?" She called me crying last night. This was my moment to control the narrative. Calmly and without emotion, I explained exactly what had transpired. She proposed a 7-day separation to reassess our relationship. Those were her exact words. I'm simply respecting her wishes by creating genuine separation as requested. If she's upset about the consequences of her own suggestion, that's something she needs to reflect on. The silence on the other end was telling. Her mother, always practical, asked pointedly, was this separation her idea? "You told me you both decided this together. I have the text messages if you'd like me to forward them." I replied evenly. This was entirely her initiative. By midday, I learned through shared friends that my wife had left work early, too upset to concentrate. Apparently, her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling as the truth spread through our social circle. The villain role she had tried to assign me was backfiring spectacularly. When she returned home that afternoon, her approach had shifted dramatically. Gone was the indignation of yesterday. Instead, she appeared subdued, almost contrite. "Can we please talk?" she asked, standing uncertainly in the doorway of what was now exclusively my living room. I looked up from my laptop. "The schedule indicates this is my time for the common areas. Your slot begins at 7 p.m. "This is ridiculous," she said. But without the conviction of previous confrontations. "Everyone thinks we're getting divorced because of your social media posts." I simply shared my experience of the separate lies you requested. I replied, "Would you prefer I lie about our current arrangement?" She closed her eyes, composing herself. "My friends were just suggesting this as a way to appreciate each other more. Not whatever this has become." I shut my laptop deliberately. Interesting how these friends offering relationship advice are all recently divorced. Perhaps not the most credible source for marriage counseling. The truth of this observation hit home. I watched realization dawn across her face. How easily she'd been influenced by people whose own relationships had failed. "I made a mistake," she admitted quietly. "Can we just end this experiment now?" I maintained unwavering eye contact. Day 3 of 7. We committed to this process. Ending it prematurely would defeat the purpose of your reflection exercise, wouldn't it? The frustration on her face was palpable. She was trapped by her own rules. Experiencing the full consequences of her impulsive decision. "Your time slot for dinner preparation starts in 3 hours. I reminded her, "I'll be using the kitchen until then to meal prep for tomorrow." As she retreated to the guest room, I received another text from her sister. What exactly did she ask for? "She's completely falling apart." I responded with screenshot evidence of my wife's original proposal. No commentary needed. The truth spoke for itself. By evening, the power dynamic had shifted completely. What began as her test of our relationship had transformed into a painful lesson about respect, commitment, and consequences. 3 days in and the experiment was yielding results, just not the one she had anticipated when she casually suggested appending our marriage for a week of personal space. The morning of day 4 marked the halfway point of our separate lives experiment. I was reviewing work documents when I heard a soft knock on the bedroom door. She stood there holding a peace offering. My favorite breakfast and coffee prepared exactly how I like it. "I thought we could have breakfast together," she suggested hesitantly. Her eyes revealed a night of little sleep, her usually immaculate appearance now noticeably disheveled. I observed the gesture without revealing my thoughts. This was classic reconciliation behavior, using food and caregiving to rebuild connection. Under normal circumstances, I might have welcomed it. But this wasn't about a meal. This was about respect. "Thank you for the effort," I said evenly. "But I've already eaten. According to our schedule, this is still my private time." Her expression fell. The carefully prepared tray suddenly meaningless. "Can we please talk?" Really talk. I think this has gone far enough. I considered her request for a moment. We can talk, but not about ending this experiment early. That's non-negotiable. Relief flooded her face as she took this as an invitation. Quickly setting the tray down and sitting at the edge of the bed, I remained standing, maintaining both physical and emotional distance. I made a terrible mistake, she began, voice cracking slightly. The girls from my office, they're all going through divorces and kept talking about how their marriages failed because they lost themselves. They convinced me we needed this separation test to strengthen our relationship. I listened without interrupting, noting how she deflected responsibility to external influences. When she finished, I responded with calculated precision. That's interesting because yesterday I had a productive conversation with someone too. I paused deliberately. A divorce attorney. The color drained from her face. What? Why would you? To understand my options. I interrupted calmly. This separation may have started as a test for you, but it's become something more significant for me. It's revealed fundamental issues about respect and commitment in our marriage. It was just a stupid suggestion. I never meant. Intent doesn't erase impact, I stated firmly. When you casually suggested dismantling our life together for a week, you revealed how easily you'd compromise our commitment. That's not something I can simply forget when your experiment ends. Tears formed in her eyes. Are you saying you want a divorce? I'm saying I'm evaluating what I want, which is exactly what you claim to need this separation for. The difference is I'm taking it seriously. She reached for my hand, which I subtly shifted away. The attorney explained interesting points about how experimental separations can be viewed legally. Did you know that in some cases they can be considered evidence of marital breakdown? This revelation hit her visibly hard. What she had framed as a harmless exercise suddenly carried potential legal ramifications she hadn't considered. This was never about breaking up, she whispered desperately. Then what was it about? Testing how much I would tolerate. Seeing if I would beg you to stay. Understanding what manipulation tactics work best on me. My tone remained steady, but my words cut with surgical precision. She had no response to this. The true nature of her experiment, whether conscious or unconscious, had been exposed. The attorney will email me some paperwork later today, I continued. Not divorce papers, but a postnuptial agreement that protects both our interests should you decide to reassess our relationship again in the future. A postnuptial agreement. Shock registered in her voice. You can't be serious. Completely serious. If our marriage continues after this week, it will be with clear boundaries and consequences for breaching them. Rising from my seated position, I checked my watch pointedly. I have a video conference in 10 minutes. Your time in the common area begins at noon. As she gathered the rejected breakfast tray, I added one final thought. By the way, I've canceled our joint credit cards for the duration of the separation. Since we're living separate lives, it seemed appropriate to separate finances temporarily as well. I've left cash on the counter for your expenses. She stood frozen, the full weight of the situation finally sinking in. This wasn't just about rearranged furniture or blocked social media. This was about the fundamental trust and structure of our marriage being systematically dismantled. All triggered by her casual suggestion to live separately for a week. Day 4 of 7. I reminded her. As I turned back to my laptop. We're only halfway through your experiment. After she left, I heard muffled crying from the guest room. I didn't feel joy at her distress, but I did feel vindicated. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come through difficult consequences, and she was learning day by day exactly what she stood to lose with her careless treatment of our marriage. The 5th day of our separation began with an unexpected silence. My wife had left early without the usual sounds of her morning routine filtering through the apartment. The note on the kitchen counter simply read, "Taking a personal day. Need time to think." I proceeded with my day as planned. Heading to work with a sense of calculated detachment. The postnuptial agreement had arrived in my email as scheduled, its legal language spelling out clear terms for any future separation or divorce. I forwarded it to her work email with the subject line for your review. Day 5. Throughout the day, colleagues noticed my changed demeanor. You seem different, my team leader commented during lunch. More focused, more decisive, just gaining clarity on some personal matters. I replied, realizing it was true. This separation had indeed brought clarity, not about whether I wanted the marriage, but about what kind of marriage I was willing to accept. I returned home earlier than usual, planning to use the empty apartment to finalize some work projects. As I approached the door, I heard it, the sound of keys frantically jiggling in the lock. Then came frustrated pounding. "Open the door." Her voice tight with panic and anger carried down the hallway. I walked calmly toward the commotion, watching as she turned at the sound of my footsteps. Her hair was disheveled, eyes red from crying. "My key doesn't work," she stated accusingly, holding up her keychain. "I had the locks changed yesterday afternoon." I responded matter-of-factly. "Separate lives, separate security. I left a message with your sister about it. You changed the locks on our apartment." Her voice rose in disbelief. "You can't just lock me out of my own home." I raised an eyebrow. "Is it your home this week? According to your experiment, we're living separate lives. I'm simply creating the appropriate boundaries." Neighbors' doors cracked open at the commotion. She noticed immediately, lowering her voice. "Let me in. We need to talk." I unlocked the door and stepped aside. As she rushed past me into the apartment, the wave of her familiar perfume brought an unexpected pang of nostalgia. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the weight of what we were risking. Then I remembered how easily she had suggested dismantling everything we'd built. Inside, she turned to face me, composure crumbling, the post-nuptial agreement. "Really? You're legally punishing me for a stupid suggestion." "It's not punishment," I corrected her. "It's protection for both of us." "This has gone too far," she insisted, gesturing wildly at the transformed department. "I've learned my lesson. Okay, I made a terrible mistake listening to my divorced friends. I never should have suggested this separation. Can we please just stop this now?" I observed her carefully. The desperation in her eyes, the trembling hands. This wasn't an act. She was genuinely afraid of losing everything. "We can discuss ending the experiment," I said finally. "But not without conditions." Hope flickered across her face. "Anything? Just tell me." "First, you signed the post-nuptial agreement," I stated firmly. "It stipulates that any future separation initiated by either party without mutual agreement results in financial consequences." She swallowed hard but nodded. "Second, we begin couples therapy, not with friends giving advice, not with self-help books, but with a licensed professional." Another nod, more vigorous this time. "Third," I continued, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "You explained to everyone who heard about this experiment exactly what happened, that it was your suggestion. That it backfired, and that you regret it. No more manipulating the narrative." This condition visibly pained her. But after a moment's hesitation, she agreed. "And finally," I said, stepping closer, "understand that trust has been broken. Not beyond repair, but significantly damaged. Rebuilding it will take time and consistent effort on your part." Tears slid down her cheeks as she whispered, "I never meant to hurt us like this. Intent doesn't change impact." I repeated my earlier words. "You casually suggested breaking the foundation of our marriage. Actions have consequences." She moved toward me, arms extending for an embrace. I stepped back slightly, not rejecting, but not yet accepting. "The experiment continues until all conditions are met," I stated. "The locks stay changed. The schedules remain in effect and you continue staying in the guest room. When the postnuptial is signed and the other conditions are in progress, then we can discuss ending this early." Disappointment crossed her features, but she didn't argue. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably where once she had felt entitled to test our relationship on a whim. She now understood that access to my life was a privilege, not a right. "I'll sign it tonight," she said quietly. "And I'll call a therapist tomorrow morning." I nodded, checking my watch. "According to our schedule, the common areas are yours for the next 2 hours. I'll be in my office." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "Do you still love me?" I paused at the doorway, considering the question carefully. Love was never the issue. I replied honestly. Respect was, and we're working on rebuilding that. The 5th day ended with her sitting alone at the kitchen table reading through the postnuptial agreement line by line while I worked in my separate space. The distance between us was physical, emotional, and now legally defined. All because she had casually suggested we needed space to appreciate each other. The final 2 days of our separate lives experiment unfolded with a striking reversal of roles. Where she had once confidently proposed this separation, she now moved through the apartment with cautious deliberation, hyper-aware of boundaries and schedules. On the morning of day 6, I found the signed postnuptial agreement on my desk, her signature still fresh on the paper. Beside it lay a confirmation email for our first couples therapy appointment scheduled for the following week. She was methodically fulfilling my conditions one by one. Later that day, while working in my office, I overheard her on the phone with her closest friend. Through the partially opened door, her words carried clearly. "No, you don't understand. This was entirely my fault," she explained, voice strained but determined. "I suggested this ridiculous separation experiment because I listened to everyone's advice except my husband's, and he called my bluff in a way I never expected." A pause as she listened to the friend's response. "No, he's not being cruel. He's showing me exactly what I asked for, what life would actually be like if we separated. And it's nothing like the empowering experience everyone described." Another pause. "The truth is, I nearly destroyed my marriage because I was bored and listened to divorced friends who projected their failures onto my relationship. I'm lucky he's willing to rebuild it all." I quietly closed my office door, giving her privacy to continue these difficult conversations. This public accountability hadn't been performative. She was genuinely taking responsibility. It was the first step toward rebuilding trust. That evening, we shared the common area for the first time since the experiment began, though still maintaining a respectful distance. She had prepared dinner, placing my portion at my usual spot before retreating to her end of the table. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began carefully, "about respect being the real issue." "You're right." I acknowledged her words with a nod, but continued eating, waiting to hear more. When I suggested this separation, I didn't consider what it actually meant. I treated our marriage like some casual arrangement that could be paused and resumed at will. She set her fork down, meeting my gaze directly. "That showed profound disrespect for you and for our commitment." "Yes, it did," I confirmed without hesitation. Her flinch at my directness was visible, but I continued. "Commitment isn't conditional or experimental. It's a choice you make daily, especially when it's difficult." "I understand that now," she said quietly. "The question is whether you believe I can rebuild that trust." I considered this carefully before responding. Trust isn't rebuilt through words. It's rebuilt through consistent actions over time. The 7th and final day arrived with a tangible shift in the apartment's atmosphere. The rigid separation had softened, not through my concession, but through her demonstrated commitment to my terms. That morning, she knocked on my bedroom door, waiting for permission to enter rather than barging in as she might have done before. When I opened it, she stood holding a small gift bag. "It's not a bribe," she clarified quickly. "Just something I want you to have." Inside was a new set of keys. One for the apartment, one for her car, and one unfamiliar key. "The third key is to a safety deposit box," she explained. "I've placed copies of our important documents there, including the postnuptial agreement. It's my way of showing I'm committed to the new boundaries we've established." The thoughtfulness of this gesture wasn't lost on me. She hadn't tried to win me back with grand romantic gestures or emotional manipulation. Instead, she'd acknowledged the seriousness of our new arrangement with a practical symbol of security and transparency. "Thank you," I said, genuine appreciation in my voice for perhaps the first time that week. As the day progressed, we moved through the final hours of our scheduled separation. The experiment that had begun with her casual suggestion had transformed into a fundamental restructuring of our relationship's power dynamic. By evening, we sat in the living room, the schedule officially complete. 7 days had passed since she had proposed living separate lives to reassess our relationship. "The experiment ends tonight," I stated, setting my glass down. "What have you learned from it?" She took a deep breath before answering. "I learned that I took our marriage for granted, that I was easily influenced by outside opinions, that what I thought would give me perspective nearly cost me everything." I nodded, allowing her to continue. "But most importantly," she added, I learned that you won't tolerate disrespect or manipulation. That your commitment deserves mine in equal measure, and that boundaries, once crossed, have real consequences. The truth of her words hung between us. This week had indeed been a test. Not the one she had intended, but perhaps the one our marriage needed. So, what happens now? She asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. Now, I replied deliberately, we rebuild with new rules, clear boundaries, and mutual respect. The guest room remains yours until I feel the trust has been sufficiently restored. She accepted this without protest. Another sign of the shift that had occurred. Where once she might have argued or tried to expedite the reconciliation, she now understood that healing would happen on my timeline, not hers. I'm willing to earn back my place in our marriage, she said with newfound conviction. However long it takes. As the clock struck midnight, marking the official end of the 7-day experiment, we stood at the threshold of what was essentially a new relationship. The casual suggestion that had been meant to reassess our marriage had indeed accomplished that goal, but not in the way she had anticipated. She had wanted space to evaluate whether she truly valued our marriage. Instead, she discovered exactly what she stood to lose. And I had reclaimed my power by refusing to be an unwilling participant in her test. Day 7 complete, I said, standing to retire to my room. Now the real work begins. The experiment was over, but its effects would endure. In trying to test our relationship, she had permanently altered it. Hopefully, in the end, for the better.